straight in. What do you see in 2014 as the security horizon?
Well, there are a number, obviously, of the issues that are in the headlines of 2013. The evolution of Iran and of Iranian relations with the United States and the Iranian nuclear development will, of course, be a key topic. The evolution of Syria and the evolution of the whole process in the region, in which several revolutions are overlapping against existing institutions between various religious sects and against the international system as it was established in the 1920s, and all these overlap. China is beginning its major reform program, but I don't think even the Chinese leaders can predict today what part of it they will be able to carry out in 2014, or what the consequences will be if they proceed on such a scale. And Europe goes through its perennial debate, which will not be resolved in 2014 either, on the nature of its cohesion, the relationship between unity and diversity. But since we don't want to keep everybody here till dinner time, why don't I start?
Well, let's take the first of those. Let's look at Iran in some more detail. Do you think it was the right decision to do this particular interim agreement?
Look, when one has conducted negotiations of this nature, it is always easy for an outsider, even an experienced outsider, to point out flaws and limitations of the agreement. There's what makes me uneasy about the agreement is that it almost recognizes Iran as a threshold nuclear country, as a country that the reason one makes that agreement is to prevent it from going in a few months to a weapons capability. And I think also that the sanctions will be difficult to sustain once the process of lifting them has started, because who wants to be the last one to maintain sanctions when the lifting of sanctions is itself part of the program? Having said all of this, I can understand the desire to bring about a political change. So the issue now is, there are three issues as I see it. One, in a way, this agreement is an option for a negotiation to settle the problem. And that means that one has to be able to define a plausible domestic nuclear program for Iran, so that one cannot take the position that Iran is not entitled to have any kind of nuclear energy, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty permits it. But it has to be done. It has to be a program that has a plausible domestic purpose, and not a step to nuclear weapons. Secondly, if one says, as the Economist says, and as I agree, if one could bring about a political change in the relationship with Iran, and if Iran behaves after that like a national state and not like a missionary Islamist state, then one can foresee many areas of cooperation, and that in fact has been the traditional relationship between Iran and the United States. And the third is that how to relate this to other evolutions going on in the region. Those are the three tasks. I'm sure there are others. Those are the three tasks that occur to me.
But if you fast forward 6 months and you get to the stage where you have to take a decision whether to go forward with this or whether to say actually Iran is not living up to it, where do you expect we will be in 6 months' time?
This is one of those things where you can either settle it quickly or not for many years.
So momentum is actually important.
The way these negotiations are conducted normally, I would say that in 6 months we will not have come to an agreement. And that the issue then will be, do we continue the present agreement? And that in turn means that the key numbers in that agreement are the 7 tons of 3.5% to 5% enriched uranium that Iran retains, plus a very curious clause in the agreement, according to which they can continue to enrich another ton during the agreement, which then they agreed to destroy. Nobody knows exactly when, say at the end of the 6 months. So if that condition continues, and then the agreement is extended, then one has in effect accepted Iran. And what I mean by a threshold nuclear country is a country that can go from where it is to building a military, a weapon in a matter of months. And some people think that with the new centrifuges, they can do it in a matter of weeks. So if that is still there in 6 months, even though the agreement is unchanged, then we are in a situation where the other countries in the region, not just Israel, have to consider their security from the point of view of the existence of a Iranian nuclear capability, military capability. And for the West, it has the problem, not so much that Iran will attack the West, but the fact is that now for 15 years, Western leaders have said that an Iranian nuclear military capability is unacceptable and that no option is off the table. So the psychological impact of Iran seeing its way through this and emerging with a recognized capability will affect their positions. I'm not saying we will reach that point. I would think it is more likely that we will reach that point in 6 months than that we will complete an agreement. It's not impossible. I do not exclude that leadership has come to the conviction that the previous route. But I must say, I used to see these American movies where some person of an unpleasant disposition gets into an automobile accident and gets hit on the head. and emerges as a saintly figure. I've never seen it in real life, but I'm open-minded.
Let's move on to the situation in China, and we've just had a rather dramatic ratcheting up of the potential for some sort of strategic miscalculation in the area with these flight identification zones declared by China. How can that, or do you think that situation can be wound back to a point where there is less risk of some sort of miscalculation on either side?
Well, there are two aspects to that identification zone. One is there are actually 44 identification zones at the borders of various countries. And that China, this is the first identification zone they have. Japan has had an identification zone for many years in parallel to this Chinese one. So in the abstract, that in itself is not a challenging, but when the identification zone includes an island that is in dispute, and when it begins to approach and maybe overlap, then, of course, there is a potential here of miscalculation. And there's the additional problem that when you have a lot of potential incidents, that you get into situations like prior to World War I, where any one incident gets dealt with, but the accumulation of it. But I don't consider that zone, it's not, my life wouldn't have been unfulfilled if it didn't exist, but it's not the key element. The key element is that, as I see, that China is undergoing a period of adjustment whose consequences cannot be fully predicted. When you move 400 million people from the countryside to the cities, you have a big technical problem, but you also have a big, not just psychological, but political problem, because the history of Europe and other regions shows when that process occurs, a change in political consciousness is unavoidable. If you tackle the problem of corruption and such, so all of these things mean that the Chinese government will be, on the one level, preoccupied with domestic reform that goes on over an extended period of time. But on the other, these various trends may generate nationalist and other ideologies which make the direction of China at the end of those 10 years certainly different from what it is today. My own estimate is that the current leadership, as I know it, would probably prefer to pursue a course of non-confrontation on major issues in order to be able to concentrate on this. But that there are undoubtedly and visibly other forces at work. I would think for the next year, I think we will see the beginning of a reform comparable to what happened after Deng Xiaoping took over.
But are you saying then that if the current leadership is for non-confrontation, why now do this
Well, because
the flight zone, which is a confrontational action?
well, it is the problem is there is this dispute about an island. This, I think, Lord Palmerston said about the Schleswig-Holstein crisis of the 19th century that only 3 people had ever understood it. One was dead, the second was in a lunatic asylum, and he was the third, and he had forgotten it. It's an island without population that used to be Chinese, was taken over by the Japanese, governed by the Japanese from Okinawa. Then when Okinawa was returned to Japan, there was this uninhabited island. And the American formula was that we recognize Japanese administrative jurisdiction, but not sovereignty. I was security advisor at the time. I don't know what that meant. And that was its advantage. Then Deng Xiaoping went to China in 10 years after that and said he didn't know what it meant. Why don't we just operate? Then now, however, Japan claims sovereignty, China claims sovereignty, and it's undoubtedly was a raising of the stake in that, but I don't think it was intended primarily as a military confrontation.
I want to ask you one more about one more part of the world, and then we'll open it up to questions. Great drama right now in Ukraine about whether Ukraine's destiny lies to be with Europe or with Russia. How do you see that getting resolved?
It's an important issue because if Ukraine becomes part of Europe, then the traditional borders of Russia, which included Ukraine, and which had Russia in the borders of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and so forth, they would be changed. And then a new geometry would arise. And conversely, the opposite would be the case. If I can make a tactless remark.
Go ahead.
Who is to blame at what stage can be debated. But I'm sort of disappointed that the Europeans did not understand the difference between the strategic issue and the human rights issue, and that they linked together the improvement of the human rights situation in Ukraine, specifically.
You mean Yulia Tymoshenko,
Tymoshenko,
particularly, yes.
It linked it together and therefore made it conditional, and therefore slowed down the process to a point where other pressures could rise. But it's, I think most people now recognize that it's an important issue. More than an important issue, it will affect the strategic pattern.
Good. Now let's have some yes. If you could keep your questions short, a lot of hands going up.
Joel Montgomery with Endeavor Global. I have a question about the U.S. influence in the world. When Obama was elected, we had the world's ear, and I think things have changed a bit. And in particular, if you look at Syria and how Russia kind of brokered this deal. And I think it really made the U.S. look poorly. And so I'm curious, in 2014 and beyond, how you think the U.S. leadership in the world stage will be positioned.
You have to understand that my view on Syria is not identical with that of the Western governments, nor with the economists. So don't blame the economists if I say something that pains you. When you talk of leadership in the world, in my opinion, you have to start with an analysis of the situation and see how the situation should be conceived. Now, the prevalent Western analysis has been this. There is an evil ruler in Syria who is oppressing his people, and therefore he has to be removed. And when he is removed, the people will live in harmony, or relative harmony, in a coalition government. That is not my analysis.
It's a bit of a caricature of the analysis, but anyway.
Well, but basically, no. The basic propositions have been that the UN should call for the removal of Assad, and that then a coalition government should be created, based on the assumption of an underlying harmony. My view is that the fundamental problem, first of all, I grant that Assad's conduct has been outrageous, and that he cannot be there when the process is concluded. So there's no dispute about that. But the fundamental issue, as I see it, is a conflict between sects, between Shiites and Sunnis, and Druzes and Christians and Kurds, and that any attempt to create one overarching government will lead to authoritarian rule of some kind, and that therefore the solution requires that the various ethnic groups can live together with relative harmony. And so one should look at something like the Lebanese situation. Now, to the extent that we were driven to look at the removal of Assad as the principal objective, it was hard to implement it. Secondly, if I understand the Russian view, it is that Russia has a large Islamic population that is likely to be affected by developments within Syria, and that therefore, if the process begins with the dissolution of all governmental authority, the danger of non-state organizations becoming dominant, or at least dominant enough to reach, would be great. So therefore, I believe that it is at least possible that Russia might cooperate with Western countries if the solution were something like what I described, or at any rate something that does not enhance the power of the non-state organizations. But it's going to be extremely difficult because the problem of the various groups in Syria is now linked to the fact, to some extent linked to the fact that the borders, the fundamental borders in the Middle East are unnatural. They grew out of an agreement made between Britain and France in the 1920s, so that these conflicts now, especially in that region, could involve Sunni Iraq and Kurdish part of Iraq linking itself with the Kurdish part of Syria. So there's no simple solution possible. I was not enthusiastic by the process by which we decided not to use military force. But I think it created a possibility of coming to a political solution.
There were many more questions. Les, question?
Oh.
Yes?
Sorry.
Yes?
Hi, Christina Saylor. I just had a question. Given that a large percentage of the Middle East and North Africa is young, educated, and also given that the region is highly underserviced, it seems like this would be a great platform for entrepreneurship. However, will the instability of the region actually prevent meaningful investments?
I think
Can you help me out with
I think that was more of an economic question, which I'd rather stick to security questions. The gentleman in the,
My question is related to China and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I was wondering, what do you think the relationship between the two will be in the future, and if at some point China might join this club?
Between who?
China and the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
might China join the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, I have advocated a concept of Trans-Pacific Partnership, as have people in Australia, because here is the problem. If China is alone in Asia, then the issue of potential hegemony becomes unavoidable. And then the inevitable approach is to militarize a historic process. For whatever reason, the two leaders have announced America accepting a rising China and China accepting America as a Pacific, participating, having a right to participate in Asian issues. Now, you can argue about the relative sincerity of these things, but I think if we try to implement it, it is at least possible that we avoid a repetition of 1914. And none of the leaders who went to war in 1914 would have done so had they known what the world would look like in 1918. So we have to prevent, if we can, a situation of escalating tensions from looking at the issues primarily as military issues. And we have to think of creating some space between China and the United States in which it is possible to compete by economic and political means. Now, I've taught international relations, and on the basis of traditional patterns, it's easy to ridicule such a proposition. But on the other hand, a situation like this has not existed before. And in China, it's not like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not play any economic role in the world. The Soviet Union's claim to influence was primarily military. The Chinese, of course, have a significant military establishment. But the traditional pattern of Chinese policy includes political, cultural, and other that will still create a challenge. But this is the way I believe we should attempt to orient our policy. We will get to the confrontational part soon enough if it turns out to be wrong.
I have one more question. Let's take one from the very front here. Yes.
Could you share your insights about Saudi Arabia refusing the seat on the National Security Council?
Saudi Arabia refusing the seat on the Security Council.
Well, Saudi Arabia, in the experience of, I think, any American secretary and official, had based its policy on reliance on the United States. And on the key issues, the United States could count on at least tacit support from Saudi Arabia. Developments over the last few years have shaken the Saudi faith in this. First, the manner in which Mubarak was dismissed. Not that we could have preserved him, but the almost cavalier fashion in which that was done. And then for Saudi Arabia, if American policy shifts, or it's perceived to shift, towards accommodation with Iran, this goes to the heart of the Shia-Sunni conflict. And so it was a symbol that they do not think that the present international structure protects Saudi interests. Some of this is unavoidable. I mean, there is a process of change going on. But there is this implication of turbulence as our relations with Iran develop one way or another. And I think right now I would say we are left in a position which is almost a watershed. It could go one way or the other, and not just because of our intention, but because of the factors I described earlier, whether we can achieve common perception. And that will be of profound consequence. And so I think, and we have seen it, Egypt has already begun moving towards a new relationship with Russia, reversing some of the results of '73. I wouldn't be surprised if Saudi would follow in that direction. And the political role of China will be enhanced as that situation develops.
Well, unfortunately, we have no more time. We've had as much of a tour of the global scene as we possibly could in the time available, but I think it's enough to give a sense of a rather pivotal year ahead in Iran and other places as well. So thank you very much to...
Because I've been wrong with occasion.